Good evening and welcome to Choices, Foreign Policy Issues in the 2020 Election. My name is Matthew Hughes and I serve as the Executive Director of the International Relations Council in Kansas City, and we are so glad to have you with us today. The International Relations Council strengthens Kansas City's global perspective by maintaining an active dialogue around world events, global issues, and their impact on our community. As a nonpartisan educational nonprofit organization, the IRC values informed civil discourse, accessibility, and substance as we work to sharpen our community's 21st century global acumen. We invite you to learn more about the International Relations Council, including other sessions in the Choices Election Issues series, other upcoming events, and how to join as a member on our website at irckc.org. The 2020 presidential election will present the American people with consequential choices around international challenges and the future of US foreign policy. In these 8 weeks leading up to November 3rd, we're talking with notable experts on foreign policy issues relevant to this year's election and what comes next. Rather than advocate a particular approach or outcome, the Nonpartisan Choices series is meant to inform voters through a presentation of historical context and a detailed examination of the foreign policy platforms of the major party candidates. We welcome diverse perspectives and encourage the community to join us in meaningful discourse around these issues of global importance. We hope you'll engage that way with us this evening as we explore peace in the Middle East. We welcome your questions through the course of the conversation using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And do check out and share the other conversations in the Choices series as we consider a range of critical foreign policy issues in the coming weeks. We are grateful to our sponsors who have made this evening's program and the Choices series possible. In particular, supporting series sponsors Nancy C. Messer, the University of Missouri, and Buttonwood Financial Group. Thank you for your support. I'm now pleased to introduce our moderator for this evening's program, who will introduce our speaker and help us navigate the conversation. Dr. Joy Stevenson, past president and board member of the International Relations Council, became the University of Missouri Kansas City's first senior internationalization officer in 2018 as UMKC centralized international recruitment, admissions advising, study abroad options, and international partnerships under international affairs. She has more than 35 years of experience in international education and has been involved with numerous related organizations, including the NAFSA Association of International Educators and Phi Beta Delta Honor Society of International Scholars. Joy, thank you so much for being with us this evening, and please take it away.
Thank you very much, Matthew. It is an honor to be part of this program series. It is so valuable right now for us to be gathering more information, speaking together politely in a nonpartisan way, and to try and advance our understanding of some very complex issues. I know that all of you in the audience have varying levels of experience with some of the deep topics that the Choices series is bringing to Kansas City. So I encourage you to take part in all of the programs. But tonight, I'm particularly pleased to be part of this one because I think clearly that it is a topic that we need to come to better understand. What better way to do so than to have Ambassador Frank Wisner with us? Many of you read his bio sketch, which was part of the promotional material for this series, and it probably jumped out at you that he has been the ambassador in 4 quite different countries. He has been the US ambassador to Zambia, to Egypt, to the Philippines, and to India. He has had a 4-decade career in diplomatic service, and he has served under 8 different presidents. So he certainly has a wide variety of experiences in the political world. I also want you to be aware that there are many parts of the world where he has been very integrally involved in some of the activities. So outside of the 4 countries where he was ambassador, I wanted you to be aware that in Indochina, he was very involved in evacuating and settling over 1 million refugees. He worked with Henry Kissinger on negotiations for Zimbabwe and Namibia. And he also was integrally involved in Kosovo with some of the independence negotiations. All areas outside of our topic tonight, but just to show you what a wealth of diplomatic experience he has. You might also be interested in knowing he is a graduate of Georgetown, of Princeton, and he now is the International Affairs Advisor for a very large law firm, Patton Boggs, which has 45 offices in more than 20 countries around the world. He has just returned to us from Helsinki, and so we're delighted that he was able to get through customs and some of the testing that may have been involved with his travels. We're so pleased that he is with us tonight. He can speak to our broad topic, and we can get more specific if any of you have a particular country in the Middle East that you particularly would like to get his perspective and his thoughts on. As we move to him as a speaker, he will take approximately 15 to 20 minutes to give us a foundation, an overview, and then around 7 o'clock, we will go to questions and answers. We have a number of questions that have been prepared, but I do suggest that if you have a particular interest, a focus you would like him to take, please put that in the Q&A. And my one request of the ambassador as he begins is, could you reflect briefly on your previous time in Kansas City, where you got to meet a man that means a great deal to many of us who are in the audience tonight, Elliot Berkeley. So I will turn it over to Mr. Ambassador and have you start with a quick reflection on your previous time in Kansas City. And then we look forward very much to hearing your thoughts on peace in the Middle East.
Dr. Stevenson, good evening. Matthew Hughes, thank you and your colleagues for making this evening possible and virtually allowing me to return to Kansas City. As Dr. Stevenson noted, I'm most impressed. In the 1970s, I returned from a tour of duty in Vietnam to the, actually at that moment from Bangladesh and Vietnam to a tour of duty in the Department of State, and found myself working on a subject that was very dear to Henry Kissinger's heart. He was National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, and he believed deeply that the State Department did an insufficient job in taking and discussing with the American public matters of foreign policy, so they were foreign and not integral to the lifeblood of the United States. And so I joined an effort that set about to correct that deficiency and to create a set of engagements around the United States that would permit us to precisely take the main themes of American foreign policy and elucidate them, debate them, discuss them with citizens across our great country. In that course, I found myself in the fortunate position of being invited to come to Kansas City. And I was invited at that moment by a really wonderful man, Elliot Berkeley, who was, as you all remember him, the life force of the IRC, but a man who was a terrific public servant, a devoted citizen of Kansas City. His brother was in politics, but he really believed in Kansas City's international vocation. and he was determined to build a bridge between Kissinger's outreach and Kansas City's interests. And that's what took me first time to your wonderful city, where I was enamored with everything I discovered. So I am delighted these many years. Sorry that Elliot is no longer with us, but I hold his memory very warmly, as I know all of you do, for his contribution to bringing foreign policy to the American people, and particularly to Kansas City. So with that as a mild way of introduction, Joy, let me turn to the reflections you've asked me to advance on peace in the Middle East. And I'll do my very best based on a near half century of association with the region and intermittent involvement in American policy. And I'll do so this evening by advancing 4 arguments. The first is important because I believe it's vital that we all are on the same page when we talk about peace. What is peace? And I'm going to argue with you that, counter to the definition that we live with at the time of Christmas, peace is much more than the absence of war and strife. It is not an end state that once achieved will endure. Peace is a process that doesn't have an end. It's a never-ending pursuit, and each step in the pursuit of peace is a pursuit of security and stability, and it opens the door to the next step. But the steps are without end. And I think it's one of the great misunderstandings of the American public that as we look at the world, we say, why can't we have peace? And if we get peace, we don't have to do anything more. Unfortunately, that's not the nature of peace. My second contention is about the Middle East, which I am sorry to say the news from that region is not good. In fact, I approach today's Middle East with a sense of distress over its disarray, especially the disarray of the Arab world. Despite the extraordinary endowments of the region, its material, cultural, historical record and histories, in the past 3/4 of a century, the region has been a disappointment to itself and a source of deep aggravation to others. It has failed to keep pace with the global economy. Its levels of education, health, and governance operate well below quality international standards. Corruption is rampant. The role of women leaves all to be desired. The rule of law is virtually unknown. All fall short of international standards. And unfortunately, I have to add to that since 2010, 2011, at the outset of the misnamed Arab Spring, the region has been not at peace with itself. It has been in constant turmoil. Civil wars in Iraq and Syria, Libya and Yemen, and today as we watch Lebanon teetering on the verge of chaos. Governments in the region have fallen. Egypt's government was swept away, as was Tunisia's. And behind the fall of superstructures of government, the region is split along ethnic, tribal, religious lines, which have torn societies apart, forced many of the citizens of the region to seek security within the confines of their kinship groups, further dividing and frustrating national coherence. This situation has left the real questions in the region unresolved. Palestine has gone unsettled as a matter of coexistence with Israel. And now we're faced with COVID-19 and the slowdown of the global economy, which has only made matters in the Middle East worse. It has brought in particular a decline, sharp decline, in the price of hydrocarbons, which is the region's principal source of revenue, which has disrupted particularly the Gulf area where the majority of hydrocarbons come from, and their government's attempts to reshape their economies, to move away from dependence on oil, and to lend a hand while they are modernizing their societies to meet the needs of other Arab nations. Jordan, Lebanon, Tunisia all depend on subsidies from the Gulf region. Those subsidies are much, much reduced, so that governments like Sudan can barely make ends meet. So worse than all of the above, to my way of thinking, and the greatest single change in my life over my lifetime is the loss of Arab agency. When I first came to the region, it was seized in the thrall of Arab nationalism. Gamal Abdel Nasser was the president of Egypt. We talked about the Arab world making decisions for itself. That agency has today completely disappeared. Arabs no longer exercise leadership among themselves to shape their policies and provide coherence. The dreams of Arab unity, or even later an Islamic resurgence, have come a cropper, and unfortunately there's no end in sight. So my third contention is that the breakdown of the internal Arab order, the breakdown of the breakdown and crises of states inside the Arab world has produced an increase in external intervention and competition. Of course, the United States has been present for many decades. The Russians were, then were not, and now are again. China has begun to intrude on the region. Iran, Turkey, and Israel all compete inside the Arab world to advance their interests. Europe is intermittently involved itself, a victim of terror and forced migration. And so when you think about it for a moment, outsiders and their proxies have stoked violence in the region, worsened competition, worsened rivalries, and further destabilized an already unhappy region. So as you stand back and look and say, what about peacemaking? You've got to realize that pretty ineffective. So far, efforts to bring the Syrian civil war to a conclusion have not worked. Libya's UN and Yemen's UN mandates for peacekeeping really have gained no traction and show little prospect of doing so. I regret to say, therefore, that as I look ahead to the balance of this year and next year, conditions in the Middle East are likely to worsen. And complicating all of these woes is the focus of American policy, a policy that is increasingly signaling a growing disinterest in the region and a sense of disengagement. From 1973, the United States had a lead in the region. It had a particular privileged position at the end of the Arab-Israel war of that year. And the United States served as an imperfect guarantor of regional stability. We, of course, did so out of our own interests. We had a deep involvement and stake in the security of the state of Israel. We were vitally interested in the secure flow of hydrocarbons from the region. And third, I think thoughtful Americans reflected on the fact that no power in history exercised global influence without a strong position in that region, a crossroads of civilizations virtually throughout history. So frankly, I'm sorry to say, and I doubt many would disagree with me, that we have squandered our position by trying to have it all our own way and by relying on the use of force. We failed to make good on our promise to secure peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and we blundered into disastrous wars in Iraq, Afghanistan as well, which have achieved no useful outcome, have undermined the image of American power, and have sapped domestic support in our policies and in our leaders, as well as undermining a broad national sense of responsibility for the region and its problems. We've actually been victims of some magical thinking that the advent of shale oil and gas has led us to believe in something called energy independence, when in fact our fate remains interlinked with the global economy, which itself is totally dependent on the orderly flow of Middle Eastern oil. So my fourth contention is that the United States, with its perceived retreat, has created a vacuum in the region, and no vacuum remains unfilled. Chaos brings in its wake an attitude from its participants to seek a new equilibrium to fill that vacuum. In the absence of an American umbrella, the nations of the Arab world and of the region are looking for new ways to assure their future and guarantee their security. And if you look today at the recent events between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel, that's exactly what has happened. They are trying to find some new way of assuring themselves in their rivalry with Iran. And others are going to follow in this path. Ties to Russia, ties to China are multiplying and will continue to multiply. The region will diversify its security connections in order to deal with the vacuum of the balance of power. So no longer we are no longer as a nation in a position to dominate events in the region. We've got to begin to rethink our position, to adjust to a new role, to recognizing the fact that the United States is one among several players, and that our interests cannot be secured by the simple exercise of military power. No stable power can be pursued without working relations with every party in the region, and that includes Iran and Turkey, which are permanent fixtures in the region and without whose participation stability cannot be achieved. And similarly, Russia is there to stay. And we need Europe as well as an ally in trying to secure stability in the region and promote our own interests. So we need to have a multi-dimensional policy where today I regret to say we have cut ourselves loose from key actors or estranged from others, Turkey, Iran, Russia. We are not in harmony, and we have no effective coordinated policy with the Europeans. So when I think about it, I have to go down to one key point, Dr. Stevenson, and that is our relationship with Iran. It is an absolute imperative. And if Vice President Biden is elected President of the United States, he has already committed himself to reopen, re-engage with Iran, set aside this policy that has not worked of maximum pressure, and rejoin the finest piece of diplomatic activity the United States engaged in the last 20 years, the JCPOA, and to do so on the simple basis of the United States rejoining on the basis of compliance for compliance, with Iran coming back in. That will be the baseline of a re-engagement that will permit us to deal with Iran, a key player in the region's affairs. So let me summarize and make a couple of points in conclusion. At the heart of my argument to all of you is the United States is party to the Middle East and its peace. It cannot be achieved without the United States being involved and the United States recognizing that its role is one of achieving stability in the region. For without stability, there is no way to take on the region's huge problems of population, economics, social inequalities, and climate change. But the heart of wisdom is to remember that we are one among several. And so, as I look forward to a new administration, I'd like to think that not only will we sort out our relations with the key actors, but we'll get involved again in the peace initiatives and negotiations seeking settlements in Syria, Libya, and Yemen, where we've lost interest and pulled back. We will rebuild our ties to Iran. That's a must. We've got to, at the same time, assure our friends in the Gulf that we're not going to leave them wanting and exposed to harm. And so our policy has to be one of sailing right down the middle of the Gulf, being involved both with Iran and with its Arab neighbors. We've got to take another look at Israel and Palestine, for while that problem continues and will continue to trouble the peace and security of the state of Israel, that the view that you're hearing these days that Israel is changing peace for peace, not land for peace, in my way of thinking, is fool's gold. And we need finally to think of new agendas as we pursue our interests in the region. Agendas that enable the United States to be part of the region's real problems, its problems of society, of economics, of climate change. And finally, I'd like to think that you have to imagine peace as some framework for managing differences and difficulties. In the closing days of the Cold War, the United States and the Europeans sat down with the Soviet Union, erstwhile Soviet Union, and its Eastern European allies in Helsinki, and came up with a way of looking at each other's interests, respecting those, and then talking through our differences rather than aiming for violent solutions. The Gulf the Arab world needs something like Helsinki, the seeds of which may have been contained in UN Security Council Resolution 598 that called for the Secretary General to bring the parties of the area, all of the parties of the area in the Security Council together to reflect on what the region needs in order to achieve some modicum of peace and stability. That's a long ways away. It won't be achieved, but I am fond of thinking that if you don't know where the road is headed, then all roads will get you there. And so this road is a long one. There's lots of hard work, but the pursuit of peace is precisely that, a complex, multi-dimensional shared process, and one that we have no way of escaping. Dr. Stevenson, I hope I haven't overspoken my piece, but I'd be happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. No, you've given us a great deal to think about and to reflect upon. My first question for you is geography. And how do you define the Middle East? More and more we hear the Middle East and North Africa, the MENA region versus only the Middle East. And I know that the scope of the topic gets very confusing sometimes in terms of that geographical definition. And so I thought it would be good to have you reflect upon that for us, please.
Well, it's a region that's known many names. I remember it being called the Near East,
Ah, yes.
and as opposed to the Far East. Um, More recent decades, we've called it the Middle East. We've added North Africa to round it out. Um, it's been a difficult region to define with any specificity, but it's been, if you think of it in historical terms, the area roughly from the borders of Pakistan running east, certainly through Egypt, uh, has been really at the center of great empires, world history, and culture since the beginning of time. North Africa is part of the Middle East culturally, historically, but it is a second-tier player in the active quarrels and disputes of the Arab region. It has its own problems. It has its own rivalries. But when you come down to thinking about addressing today's problems, the rivalries between Turkey, Israel, Iran, the Arab region in the east, the civil wars in Syria and Yemen and Libya, and the chaos in Sudan, these are really more in the Middle East, if you will, that area between roughly Pakistan and Egypt, Libya.
Great. Thank you very much. We have a question that has come in. Would you be willing to try and explain the UAE-Israel compromise in layman's terms, just to help us understand that better, and then give us your thoughts on the deal, the arrangement?
Well, I happen to be a great fan of the arrangement. I believe that Israel is a permanent part of the region, and the more Israel has ties to nations in the region, the more the outlines of live and let live will emerge, and there will be a secure future, not only for Israel, but for the rest of the region. But I'm shy about going further than that, and saying that it is in and of itself, it is going to create a new peace dynamic. I simply don't believe that. My Israeli friends are fooling themselves if they think that they are trading peace for peace, in this case with two nations with which they've never been at war, and that land for peace, the resolution of the Palestinian problem, will not continue to fester and destabilize Israel's future. So it isn't more than it is. It happens in this case. Bibi Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, has made a promise that he won't annex more land in the occupied territories in the West Bank. Fine, but I know that he fully intends to continue building out settlements, so the land issue isn't really settled either. So what does the agreement achieve? It brings Israel and the Gulf together potentially in a constructive way. The nations of the Gulf, led in this case particularly by the UAE, are trying to move away from a hydrocarbons-based economy to one that is high-tech. And Israel's endowments, capital from the Arab region, find a perfect fit. And I know that the UAE and significant degree Israel look forward to that kind of deepened collaboration that begins to address serious economic needs. So I think the agreement has that as a meaning. And then finally, there is another feature to the arrangement, and that is American politics. President Trump jumped into the region, signed up with the Saudis, the UAE in particular, and took on Iran in what has evolved into a policy of maximum pressure and a really deep and extremely dangerous, fraught arrangement with Iran. That is a state of affairs that cannot and must not, should not endure. But the nations of the Gulf, which signed up to join President Trump's march, are also looking at the poll numbers here. And they recognize that if Trump is no longer president, then where are they? And so my friends in the UAE in particular looked at the prospect of sending some signals to the Democratic side of the House, where Israel's reputation is strong, and reaching out and holding hands with Israel. In so doing, they accomplished another fact, and that is they've kind of helped the Democratic Party bridge its own internal differences over Palestine and Israel by stopping the annexation. So they've done us a favor, done the Democratic Party a favor, and therefore opened the door to some support in our Congress for key weapons acquisitions. They're in the market for the F-35, and they had no chance of getting it before. It'll still be a tough sell, but they have a much greater chance of having this first highest quality American aircraft now that they have squared their way with both sides of our political aisle. I was asked to give you a simple explanation, and I hope I didn't make it worse.
No, no, we appreciate all the words you share with us. You have touched upon the politics, which are a major part of what we are dealing with day by day right now. So we want to ask you to look at it in a balanced way. If Trump is reelected, what impact will that have on peace in the Middle East? And then the other side of that coin, that if Joe Biden is elected, what impact would that have on peace?
Well, these are very good questions, and I don't think I found many answers to them last night in that raucous exchange between the two gentlemen. There have been very little elaboration of foreign policy at all during the course of the campaign. And so I don't have any bright light to shine, but I have some assumptions that I think are safe to share. I think we know the card game that President Trump will play because he's been playing it. He's taken sides with the Gulf in the Middle East. He's taken sides with Israel. He's disengaged from the ordinary making of peace and the quarrels of the region. He's begun a strong signal of disengagement of American interests, getting American soldiers out of Iraq and eventually out of Afghanistan. All of that will continue. The most sensitive piece of the play, though, is Iran. Will we just mindlessly continue maximum sanctioning of Iran and disruption of it, most recently in the United Nations? Is that where we're headed? If President Trump is reelected, will the Iranians simply continue a policy of defiance? Will the failed attempts at Biarritz by President Macron be revived in some form, where President Trump seeks to make the deal of the deals, and the Iranians recognize it would be better to have some understanding with the United States to relieve pressures on their economy? I can't tell you that for sure. That's certainly out there as a possibility, albeit remote as we sit where we are today. On the other hand, President Biden will have certain directions, and he's made those pretty clear. He's going to be a strong friend of Israel, no question. I would bet you that that does not mean he will resume the practice of President Obama, President Clinton, previous presidents to try to get in the middle of the Israel-Palestine matter. He probably looks at that and says, this is a no gain, much pain process. And he's got a lot of things to do at home and elsewhere in the world before he spends his personal capital on something that is as hard to achieve as some negotiated settlement between Palestinians and Israelis. But looking at the Gulf, there isn't any doubt in my mind that our relationship with Saudi Arabia is going to change, and our relationship with Iran has the potential of changing. Will these changes be done in a balanced way? That we'll have to see the skill of a President Biden, if that's what he ends up being. And I think he will be aided in this regard by quite a deep bench of talent. People who served in the Obama administration before, who know the region and will bring certain sensitivity to it, where the Trump bench has been notably shallow. So I see us becoming much more involved in the region, but not involved with soldiers, involved with political policies if Biden is elected president.
Thank you. We have a question. For those who would like to see us less engaged, do you see any way that we might be able to pull out, to be unnecessary to everything that goes on in the Middle East?
Well, I think that would be a very, I would personally disagree with that as a strategy. And I can absolutely assure you, the day we pulled out of the Middle East is the day we have to start going back in, because trouble will pursue us. It's not pulling out of the region. It's stop doing dumb things. It's stop going to war and using American soldiers to try to bring democracy or enforce peace. That's not where we ought to be. You can be engaged in the region politically. You can be part of trying to negotiate an end to the Syrian civil war, or the Libyan crisis, or the Yemeni crisis. All of these problems look for American participation to help balance, to find compromises. That's political engagement. It doesn't cost heavily in treasure, and it certainly doesn't cost blood. And so I see an America that is engaged in the region, but engaged politically with a strategy of trying to achieve stability and thereby contribute towards a calmer, more peaceful situation.
Thank you. Great answer. Another issue is that there are a number of countries that have internal turmoil. And so even looking at Israel with the internal turmoil that they have, how will that impact their progress towards dealing with the Palestinian state? And again, the whole issue of peace in the area.
Well, it's going to be very difficult. And that's why when I describe if Biden becomes president, why I don't think he'll be rushing to try to jump in between the Israeli government and the Palestinians. And the reason is pretty simple. You can help make peace when people want to make peace. But the Israeli house is terribly divided. The Israeli house is divided between those who see the need to find a basic settlement with the Palestinians, either a land settlement or a shared common occupation in a one-state solution in which Palestinians are equal citizens, and those who want to treat Israel as a Jewish state without a significant external population in their midst. There's no consensus in Israel. Israeli politics are tied up in knots. And they've had several elections this year. I think they're going to have another one, and I doubt they're going to find an early or easy solution. So if they don't know the basis of peace that they're achieving, then turn the page and look at the terribly weakened Palestinian Authority, where I think Mahmoud Abbas is serving the 12th year of a 3-year term in office, badly in need of fresh ideas, badly divided between Gaza's Hamas and the West Bank's PLO. There isn't much coherence in their thinking and no ideas that have been put forward with any freshness about how to engage Israel. So you got a divided Israel, divided Palestinian account, and trying to get in the middle of that and make any sense just seems to me not the best way in a busy world for a newly elected president to spend his time.
True. Let's look briefly at Iraq. Is it true that Iraq may be turning towards Iran, and what impact, might that have on politics in the region?
Iraq cannot survive without a balanced relationship with Iran. Iraq, at the same time, is an Arab land, and it will not be assumed into Iran. And so the complexity of Iraq is how you keep the three elements of the society, the Shia majority, the Sunni minority, and the Kurdish minority together, and keep a balance between the Arab world and Iran, and in the midst of all of this, still be able to walk and chew gum. And it's a really difficult place to be. But the Iraqis do not intend to be satraps of the Iranians. And I can assure you from the Iranian point of view, they don't want to rule Iraq. They know that having a huge Arab population in some sort of imperial domination would be indigestible, but they want influence. They want to be sure they're not going to have another Iran-Iraq war, not to find themselves attacked with nearly 500,000 dead in the wake of it. People here in this country forget what a dreadful contest that was, what a huge price both countries paid. And if Iran has one core definition of its future, it's to secure itself from the prospect of external military involvement. Iran historically has been a nation often invaded. It's in their DNA to try to secure themselves. So they like arrangements in their neighborhood that are compliant, that understand the need to act as a buffer, a peace buffer for Iran. That holds true for Afghanistan, and it holds true for Iraq.
Can you say a little bit about working with the hereditary leaders, the families that lead many of the countries in the Middle East? How is that able to function well in terms of our diplomacy?
I think, well, you've asked a very good question. I took considerable issue with the Obama administration when we sent out signals that the royal houses of the Gulf had to get into the 21st century and begin to open their doors to participatory democratic practice. I think that was a message that simply said to them, we want their necks. And therefore, they were only too happy to jump into President Trump's camp as soon as he came close to winning and won the election. That's not the right way to proceed. We're not in the Middle East to, I don't believe, our mandate in the Middle East is to try to re-engineer the governance of the area, produce democracy in our wake. That's exactly the kind of dragon abroad we don't need to go off to slay. But what we can do is set examples of what is reasonable, to be an advocate of human rights, to encourage democratic processes, to encourage the rule of law, to encourage and be the friend of free press and free expression, but not to enforce it, not to presume that we know how to take these ancient lands and remodel them on our own domestic experience, which, if we think about it for a moment, has some flaws in it. So a little modesty, and we can find a balance. The world is made up, like your neighborhood is, of people that you like, maybe don't like too much, have common interests with, maybe do not have common interests with, but you all learn to live in a neighborhood. And that's the way to think about the globe, not as a everybody wears the same size 10 shoe and expected to walk in each other's path.
I've been very fortunate. I've been able to recruit all over the world and in all of the countries of the Middle East. And you're right, the diversity is just tremendous, but it's such an opportunity to learn more about cultures, religions, history, and their view of the future, where they are headed. As you reflect upon the entire area and upon diplomacy from the United States view, what is a surprise? Matthew wrote a question about what would most of us in the US be surprised if you were to share some of your insights with us?
Well, that's a demanding, tough question. I'm not sure I'm up to giving you a good answer, Joy. I look at my country as having a stake in the Middle East, but we are one among many. And that we have to aim to do things that are achievable with the resources and the time available to us. We cannot remake societies. We can't stamp out democratic experiences and expect people from ancient lands with very different traditions of leadership to follow those. So modesty. We need also to remember that we've got to take the steps we take by understanding where other people's interests lie and trying to accommodate our interests and theirs. And it takes a while and it's painful, but that's the way to do it, because compromise, second bests are often the very best. And finally, I would argue, as I look at the Middle East, I want to make sure I'm doing this with some allies. And I really believe the United States has a God-given privilege to have strong European allies, but our alliance is stronger if we treat each other with the respect the other is due.
No, it's a wonderful way to end, with respect and education and learning about others, knowing we are one among many, and we want the best for all the peoples there. I have one last short question for you. I hope that in the audience tonight, watching on Zoom, there are many students, and some of them will be very interested in international studies, international relations, and they may be hoping that one day they will have a diplomatic career. And so could you say just a few words to everyone about the path that they might choose to walk now if they are going into diplomacy?
Well, you know, that's a challenging question, and it's particularly challenging now when I have observed over the past 4 years the dismantling of core public service functions, scientific expertise, environmental expertise, foreign policy expertise, the end of the kind of deliberative processes of government that meant decisions were taken after some reflection. We didn't always get it right, but we were careful, not just whimsically rushing into major commitments of American prestige, influence, and resources. And so It may look pretty grim right now, but the nation, we are part of a world, economically, politically, security. We can't sit here in this country and point missiles out and expect to live happily ever after. It won't work that way. We have to be able to share this global space. And the onset of the climate crisis reminds us we're all in this together. We cannot secure our well-being and future except in combination. We can't defeat pandemics except in combination. We can't bring about an economic recovery unless it's done on a global basis. And therefore, we will inevitably be involved. Now, what is the right path towards involvement? If I were a student today, I'd look at a number of options out there. And there are a number. There's American business that is abroad. There are lots of attractive opportunities in banking and in business as you engage around the world. There's probably less in the media, but in social media, new forms of media, there's some exciting opportunities there. And then there is a huge world of education, of non-governmental organizations, great institutions like the International Rescue Committee and others that deal with crises situations around the world, all call on the highly motivated spirit of young Americans. And then there's public service, government service. That's the path I chose. I continue to believe that the public service is a really very high calling. And it was enormously satisfying for me in my life. I don't think it's everybody's cup of tea, but it certainly was mine. And it's led to a lifetime of sensitivity to thinking about the way other people live, feel, react, understand, which gives me greater insights into my own country and into myself. And so the Foreign Service may be drawing on a shrinking population today as the service itself is under pressure from its present betters, but that won't always be the case. And the swearing of an oath to the Constitution of the United States is a very high calling. And I recommend the young people in the audience who are thinking about the world, of how to be involved in it, about how to make a difference, that public service is a really good choice.
Thank you for those words. And thank you for your years of service representing the United States. We're honored to have had you with us this evening. And
Thank you, Joy.
Turn it over to Matthew.
Ambassador Wisner and Dr. Stevenson, thank you so much for this really insightful and broad-reaching conversation on a critical topic, continuing topic for our time. We hope the audience will join us in future weeks as we consider other issues in the Choices Election Issues series. Next week, we're proud to feature Melissa Dalton from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, who will be talking about a related topic of military and diplomacy and how we balance that in the world. So do check us out, irckc.org, and we wish everyone a very pleasant evening. Thank you so much.